Go now.
Okay, so welcome everybody. We appreciate that you have us here, Paul. Greatly appreciate for the guys in attendance and gals in attendance, and for those that watch the replay, make sure that you indicate replay and we'll circle around and we'll answer questions if you post under the video. So we're here today because there are a lot of issues that are going on due to COVID-19 in the legal system. And a lot of those issues stem from the fact that the government doesn't know how to run the court system during the pandemic. They're behind times. They're not utilizing phone hearings as much. Like, they do have the option, but they don't utilize it as much.
Okay.
And other methods. So what we've seen in specifically the landlord and tenant board is, before COVID-19, we were seeing a backup. We were seeing a backup of up to 6 months or more to even get your matter heard before the board. And that was due to the lack of adjudicators. Now we're seeing that pretty much almost everything's been suspended. So evictions are at a standstill. You can still issue notices, but filing is also at a halt. And so the question becomes, well, what do I do? I'm an investor, I'm a landlord, I have tenants, these tenants aren't paying. That's why we're here today, to talk about solutions, right? Because now we have to think outside of the box during an unprecedented time and figure out what is the way to deal with this, right? Because this is something that we've never had to face before, and the board doesn't know and the government doesn't know. So we're here to talk about solutions. They're not absolute. And also keep in mind that we're just giving information and some strategies based on what we've seen so far, and that each individual situation may be dealt with differently than what we're saying here. So advice right off the jump is get legal advice, right? Get legal advice about your particular situation, okay? So now I'm going to pass it over to Dan, who's going to talk to you about, because today's seminar is about rent and how tenants may not be paying their rent. So Dan's going to talk about that a little bit more, and I'll jump back in. And if there's any questions, please, by all means, anyone that's online with us now, raise your hand if we can see you. There's a hand symbol that you guys can use under the reactions button.
You click on participants and there is a hand symbol up there.
Yeah, so whatever way you want to do it, or in the chat, just say, I have a question, and we will stop and answer your question.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Dan.
No problem. Would you like to do this off the presentation?
Let the show begin, Dan.
All right, perfect. So one of the things that we're going to do is just as a way of keeping a little bit organized today. We're going to try and do this as a bit of a presentation, just to kind of keep everybody on board. So one of the things is have you applied for the CERB benefit yet? If you have not, the number is listed on our screen. It's 1-800-959-2019. And this is at the moment, there's no pre-screening for this. You simply call up, provide your social insurance number, year of birth, and they issue you a check. Come income tax time, they will sort out whether or not you were entitled to it or not. And at that point, we'll either request a clawback or not. So what are some of the things that we're going to discuss? So what are some of the common issues with COVID-19? So what's happening with the tribunal, non-payment of rent? People are calling us up, asking us if they're still allowed to inspect their rental units, asking us what their maintenance obligations are, asking us if they're selling their unit, you know, if they need to do a purchaser's own use application, how that's supposed to work, and also tenant conduct. So what's happening with the board? So as Samantha had said, the Landlord and Tenant Board has currently suspended all of their in-person hearings.
Okay.
Some of their hearings are being heard over the phone as an attempt to minimize delay. But as a general rule, right now the board is only hearing issues where there is a serious impairment or an illegal act. And on those particular ones, you can request that the board hear it. It is not automatic. It is not guaranteed. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the big question we get is, can a landlord evict a tenant for non-payment of rent? So let's talk about this, because this is the big issue, right? Everyone's wondering about this. So the Ontario government has released no new legislation that would allow a tenant to not pay rent. Now, the government is also aware that people have lost their jobs, people have lost their main sources of income, we were talking with Mr. Cheema before we did this, the presentation went live, that our revenue as a company has dropped 90% because we derive most of our revenue from going to court. The court's closed. So am I still required to pay my rent? Well, the short answer is yes. I'm absolutely still required to pay my rent. Now, what will the board make, how will the board make a determination on a non-payment of rent situation based on COVID-19? So now, I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of background noise.
I'm muting them, don't worry. Yeah.
So I'm hearing a lot. So I want to keep you in mind when I say what I'm about to say. This is based on my knowledge of being a litigator that's in front of the landlord and tenant board at least 10 times a month. So there's no specific guideline that's been released. I'm just looking at this based on the test of reasonableness and based on what I think the landlord and tenant board will do once hearings resume. So if you had a tenant who was otherwise a good tenant, paid the rent on time, paid it in full every single month, and then COVID-19 hit, I suspect that the solution in most cases will be a payment order where the adjudicator says either because they've mandated it or because they have you've mediated it, it will be a payment arrangement of some sort to make up the rent that's there. That's if the tenant was a good tenant previously and the only thing that impacted them was losing their job. I suspect that if they still owed rent in the beginning of March or the beginning of February, and that you were issuing notices that encompass those months as well, that the board's probably not going to treat that non-payment of rent any differently than they would had COVID-19 not happened. I think it's also going to make a big difference as to what the tenant says the reasons for withholding rent were and what they prove. If a tenant says, well, I didn't pay my rent because I didn't think I should have to because I lost my job, then that's not going to hold very much weight with an adjudicator. And another thing that's going to hold a lot of weight, and this is important for tenants as well as for landlords, you need to communicate with each other. The board is going to look at the communication that you have with your tenant and use that as a basis for determining whether or not an eviction is required. So if your tenant has communicated with you as a landlord, or if you as a landlord have attempted communication with your tenant in order to come to some sort of an agreement, then the board will look at that and they will see how the parties responded to each other. Now, when should the notices be issued? Well, my opinion on this hasn't changed forever. If rent is due on the 1st, on the 2nd, you should be issuing your notices. It is that simple. Not, not after 30 days, not after 10 days, not after 5 days. If rent is due on the 1st, you should be issuing notices on the 2nd. The only place that I would change that opinion now is if your tenant has made arrangements with you and they've said, I can pay you $500 now and my rent is $1,500 a month. As opposed to filing for an eviction order, you can file for an order that just is a simple determination that the tenant owes you money. And if you file that along with the payment agreement form approved by the board, which is available on the Landlord and Tenant Board website. Yes, Paul. You're muted at the moment, Paul. I can't hear you.
So my question here is, if the tenant agrees to pay a partial rental payment and both of these guys agree, landlord and tenant, would they have to make some changes in the current agreement they have, or should they write another addendum to the previous agreement that today the tenant agrees to pay X dollars and remaining rent will be paid in any other agreed upon fashion?
May I talk about this?
Sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Is there a way I can share my screen for one moment?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So hang on here, share screen. I cannot share my screen. Okay, never mind. So Dan, you're gonna have to share your screen to show this. I'm gonna post a link to our website, but to Paul, to answer your question, the answer is you don't have to change your current agreement. What you need to do is continue to issue the correct notice. So if you're doing an N4 or an L9, whatever that may be, whichever one you choose. The N4 is the one with the eviction. The L9 is for just arrears. if the tenant wants to enter into a repayment agreement, there is a form from the board that you can use for the repayment agreement. And I highly suggest that if that's what you're doing, you're still issuing the notice and doing the repayment agreement, because the last thing you want to have happen is a tenant say, okay, well, my rent is $1,500. My landlord allowed me to reduce my rent, so my new rent is only $500. And they'll try to say that their rent is now a different price than what it is. So to preserve the amount of rent, issue them the notice and then enter into the repayment agreement after that. And in that link I just posted in the chat, what it has, if you scroll down to the middle of it, it has actually clickable buttons. So it says step 1, issue and serve an N4. Step 2, you can file the L1. And step 3 is file the payment agreement form. I wanted to show you guys those forms. Then if you guys want us to show them to you, I can pop them up on the screen for you at the end. But to answer your question, just utilize these processes. It's not necessary to make changes to your agreement.
Okay.
Just remember, with anything landlord-tenant, it is only legally enforceable if it goes through the landlord and tenant board.
Right. Yeah.
So having a side agreement or having an agreement on the side, you do run the inadvertence, like Sam had mentioned, of inadvertently changing your monthly rent or changing the entitlements of how things are paid. With the landlord and tenant board and using landlord tenant board approved forms, you have the ability to get everything done in a legal, easily understood manner that is enforceable. And that's the key. It has to be enforceable. So that's where I would come in.
So you mean even if the tenant agrees that he has to pay $1,500 in rent, but today because of his precarious condition, he agrees to pay only $500. So you're saying that will be construed as change in the rental amount?
No, it not automatically on its own, but the problem is that when people use their own forms, they use their own language as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you run the risk, and we had a client who wanted us to look over a letter for their client, for their tenant, and the letter only said, we agree that we are reducing your rent during this time to $500 a month.
Okay.
Now, you and I both know that a reasonable person will look at that and say, well, obviously that's just for now during COVID. Nobody's expecting the rent to be reduced that much. But an adjudicator doesn't have the luxury of determining that. They have a legal way of looking at things. And the tenant could very easily misconstrue that message as, my rent is now $500 a month. So by doing everything on a board-approved form, which is signed by the tenant, which is signed by the landlord, everything is very, very clear, you eliminate the risk of ambiguity.
Right.
Okay?
Yes.
So that's important. Now, another big question that we get asked by people is, as a landlord, can I still inspect or show my unit? Well, real estate agents are governed by the Real Estate Council of Ontario. They're governed by the Toronto Real Estate Board. And those two organizations have released guidelines and authorities on how agents are to show properties right now. So let's just look at this as from a landlord perspective. Should a landlord go in and perform an inspection? Well, under normal times, then yes, absolutely. In fact, the landlord has a statutory obligation to perform unit inspections. This affects their ability to collect damages. This affects their ability to collect, any unpaid rent. Is that a landlord has an obligation under the Act to inspect, and by not fulfilling that obligation, it does not give them the ability, the right to just carte blanche file a claim in small claims. With COVID, we're now getting into a different area. So if I'm a tenant, I don't know where my landlord has been. I don't know if my landlord has been social distancing. I don't know if my landlord perhaps has had contact with somebody who's sick. And now they're asking to come into my rental unit during this time where there's a pandemic. I would argue that unless it is an emergency, a landlord should not be doing damage inspections at the moment. Okay. I just, the law is unclear. I mean, I have here on my slide, what is the law? Okay, so understand that there is no case law, right? So in Canada, we rely on what has happened before. And this has never happened before. So we don't actually, we don't have a 100% or a 99% answer of whether or not what we're saying is correct or not. But one of the things that the Landlord and Tenant Board looks at, or courts look at, is something called reasonableness. Is it reasonable? So I live in my house with my 3 children. My 3 children are all under the age of 14. I don't want anybody coming into this house right now. Right? So unless it's an emergency, okay, which is what my suggestions are. If a tenant calls you up and says, my heater's broken, if a tenant calls you up and says, my fridge doesn't work, if a tenant calls you up and says, my stove is broken, I have no electrical power, there's no hot water. Yes, absolutely. You have a duty under the law to perform maintenance and ensure that those things are fixed.
Okay.
But other than that, I would avoid your rental unit as much as possible. Okay. Now, if a tenant's tested positive for COVID-19, who's responsible for cleaning the unit?
That's a good question.
Right? So as an example, I live in a house where there's tenants in the basement. So if the tenants in the basement test positive for COVID-19 and we share an HVAC system and we share a laundry facility, how am I supposed to know that I can't get sick off that other tenant? So again, we have no positive law that would state this, but we know that landlords are responsible for roach and bed bug infestations. We know that landlords are responsible for performing, pest control, spraying. We know that landlords are responsible for a number of things. So there is no reason for us to believe at this point that the landlord would not be responsible for a tenant who tests positive for COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So we believe, based on what we've read and based on our articles, and I believe we have an article on our site in relation to this, which Sam will post. We believe that if it is the landlord's responsibility to hire a cleaning company who is able to handle a COVID-19 infection, mm-hmm. to go into a rental unit and clean. And the only time we can see somebody not being responsible is if the tenant is a hoarder or if the tenant's premises are generally unclean to the point where it's impossible to clean the unit. That's another story altogether, okay? But at that point, the landlord would have a positive obligation to ensure that the people living above those tenants wasn't capable of getting sick. Now, I don't know necessarily what those precautions would be. I think that would be case by case. But it's certainly something that we need to look at. Okay. So as a real estate agent, Paul, and for your clients or for other agents that are listening, a big one that we get is purchaser's own use applications. So a purchaser buys a property and wants to move into it, right? So before COVID-19, you would issue an N12, and the N12 would be 60 days notice, minimum, ending on the last day of the rental period. And you would file it with the Landlord and Tenant Board right away. A year and a half ago, you would usually have gotten your hearing within 45 days, so still within the notice period. Then the last 6 months, because of some shortages in personnel at the board, that became a 5 or 6 month window. So for instance, I filed an application in January, first week of January, and got a date of June 6th. Okay. With COVID, we have no idea when hearings are going to come back online again. So what is the challenge? How can you guarantee vacant possession of a property? when the only body in the province who can order a tenant out, which is the Landlord and Tenant Board, is closed. So these are things to keep in mind, because we don't want to incur penalties. We don't want to incur a situation where a property that has been sold doesn't close as a result of the inability to provide vacant possession. So this is something that needs to be looked at. Another thing that needs to be looked at, and this is something that we tell both the general public as well as real estate agents, only a member of the law society or the landlord is allowed to complete notices by law. Now, there was a period of time where the Landlord and Tenant Board really wasn't enforcing that, but they are now. So you want to take into consideration that there is a very real risk that if somebody other than the landlord or a legal representative completes the forms, that they will be kicked out. So especially now in a time where hearings are delayed and other such things are delayed, you want to make sure that all of your I's are dotted and all of your T's are crossed before you serve the notice, and to make sure that it's done properly the first time around.
Okay.
Now, this is a big one, okay? So what happens if a tenant isn't social distancing, and what are the tenant's obligations during COVID-19? So this is important. As I said before, I don't want anybody coming into my house, but what happens if I live in a multi-unit building? So there are other people walking in the hallway that I use to access my unit. There are other people in the laundry room that I'm using to wash my clothes. What happens if they're still having parties and doing it up? Well, the first thing I would suggest is that because of the bylaws and because of the measures enacted by the government, you would have the right to call police during this time, to have that dealt with through police. But from a landlord perspective, you can actually apply to evict your tenant. And I would argue that during COVID-19, that you would have the right to file this as a serious threat to safety for the people living in the rental unit.
Social distancing from whom? From the landlord? Or
well, so for instance, as I mentioned before, there's tenants who live in the basement of the house that I currently live in. If they were to have a party and invite 20 people over to their unit.
all right. Yeah, I got it. Sorry, I missed that part.
Yeah. They're still using the laundry facilities that I use. They're still using common areas of the building that I use. And if they get sick, it's a serious impairment of my safety. And if they get sick because of their own irresponsibility, it's a serious impairment of my safety. So I would argue that if you have tenants that are doing this in a multi-unit building, that there is grounds to evict them through the Landlord and Tenant Board on an urgent basis during this time of COVID. Now, the board may disagree with me on that. We haven't gotten a lot of these, but based on the law, I believe that that's a reasonable assumption to make.
Okay.
So are there any questions based on what we've talked about thus far?
Yes. Anyone in the audience can ask any question they have. Let me unmute everybody's microphones. I'm trying to see how I can do that. Yeah, all my participants' microphones are unmuted. If anybody has question, please come forward and ask it. So are you getting lots of cases like that these days, like landlords contacting you, trying to get some information on how they can address that situation with their own tenants?
Yes, a lot actually.
Mm-hmm.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was talking to myself. Yeah, so we're getting landlords that are concerned about how they're gonna get their rent. We've had landlords call, I've had landlords call me and flat out say, listen, I'm locking them out. And I'll tell you, I can tell you that the police have been involved. The police usually don't get involved in these situations, but with lockouts during the pandemic, they are getting involved. And what they're doing is they're going to the landlord and they're saying, open the door for the tenant, give them a key, change the lock back, or we will charge you. So that's unusual. That's not normal practice, but this is what I've seen so far. So when a landlord calls me and says, yeah, I'm locking them out, I'm going to say to them, you didn't get that advice from me. I wouldn't do that. That's a bad idea.
Okay.
You need to try to find a way, provide the resources to the tenant, talk to the tenant, get some payment from them, something from them. But the only thing you can do right now is really negotiate with them and do a paper trail. Keep everything documented. Even a conversation that you have with them that's in person verbally or over the phone, that should be recorded, because you never know what's going to happen, right? And the last thing you need is, oh, well, my landlord discriminated against me. Oh, my landlord, they harassed me. And listen, they'll bring the applications. They will. So the best thing to do is document, and try to negotiate and be understanding at this time. I know it's not the best answer. It's not really, like, a lot of landlords don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear that I can evict them. I want to hear that there's a remedy for me. And right now, because the government doesn't know what to do, there isn't that remedy. So all we can do is work with these tenants. I can tell you in the last couple of days, so we're on the 17th of the month. We issued a bunch of N4s on the 2nd. I've had at least 3 tenants text message me saying that they are offended that I would dare issue them an N4.
Oh.
And my answer to them is, don't fight with them, is to respond in a manner that basically says something along the lines of, listen, I understand it's hard times. I'm issuing you the N4 as a reminder. Please don't take offense to it. I'm protecting both myself and you. And if they ask you, well, how are you protecting me? I'm protecting you because I want to keep record of the rent that was given. And so that's how I'm doing it, along with the receipt. Whatever you do, keep it positive. That is my best advice. Like, I've had a landlord call me, say, I called my tenant and I started yelling at them, and blah. Don't yell at them, because you can't. You have no remedy. So all you can do is really talk to them and negotiate. For the agents that are watching, if you are going for vacant possession, key here is getting a signed agreement, some sort of release if you want, a signed N11, something in writing. Not just, okay, they're leaving, no problem, they're just gonna go. They need to hand you the key, give you vacant possession, right? Get it documented. If you can put some terms together, go for it. But that's my advice to the agents, because I had an agent call me the other day saying to me, well, yeah, they agreed to leave, in a text message, never handed me the keys. Well, if the board was open, the board would say that's not vacant possession until they hand the keys over.
Yeah.
So those are some big things that I'm seeing. The last one I just saw today, a tenant sent a wish list of repairs, 30 items long. And the reason that they sent that list was because they were upset about the N4.
Oh.
Okay. And these are things like, oh, I have a scratch on my wall. Oh, my apartment's not clean. Oh, my wall is cold. Like, these are not, remember, maintenance means that the unit needs to be fit for habitation, has to be in compliance with health and safety standards, right? And up to code. So when they're saying to you, oh, there's a scratch on my wall, they're doing that because they're upset, right? And that's why I said you have to try to nip it in the bud right away. And say to them, listen, I got your list. Thank you so much. I will, due to COVID, these are not emergencies, but I will be happy to work with you to rectify issues if I can, right? Be mindful that that's how it's going to go down. Now, if you're getting a tenant that's really belligerent and really upset, all you can do is just issue them the notices. And once the board opens up filing again, fax your notices in right away and keep a copy proof that you faxed it, and follow up in 14 days and send an email to the board. They are overloaded. They were overloaded to begin with, and now they're even more overloaded. So I hate to say be patient, because I don't want to be patient with it. I'll tell you, my clients don't want to be patient, and I'm sure you guys who are watching don't want to be patient. We were dealing with 6-month delays, and who knows what it's going to be now. So unless the board opens it up to phone hearings for non-payment, best thing to do is negotiate everything as much as you can. And if it means hiring a mediator or getting someone that's skilled in negotiation, I would suggest spending the money to do it.
Well, I checked up the website, and it says only if there is an emergency, like threat of bodily harm or major damage.
Yeah.
Other than that, LTV is not going to respond.
Not right now.
There are special lines for those purposes. So But by the way, in your opinion, what are majority of tenants thinking, Samantha? Do you think that they can just get away without paying the rent, or that they know that they will have to make up the rent in the end? So what do you think? What are you seeing more and more?
What I'm seeing is they think that the mortgage deferral has something to do with them not having to pay rent. And that's untrue. Okay. If a landlord chooses a mortgage deferral, that's up to them. That has nothing to do with the obligation to pay rent. A tenant still has to pay rent. There is nothing that says that it suspends it. And the government, I mean, it's our rentals. I know they want to control our rentals. I understand, but they're not saying don't pay rent either. What they're saying is we are offering you resources. And Dan had that slide up for the resources. There are many resources for small businesses. There's resources for individuals. Look into the resources. Tenants can get money. There's a rent bank that still exists. There's social services. There's OW. There's EI. There's all different resources. So what I've been seeing is I see the boards. I get tenants that even call me. I don't represent tenants, but that are saying, I've had tenants say to me, well, my landlord is harassing me by asking me for rent. Well, no, your landlord has a right and you have an obligation to pay. This does not suspend your rent. You have to understand that if you don't pay your rent, what you're doing is causing your landlord to potentially go under and have to sell the property. So if they sell the property, what happens? Oh, well, maybe the new owner will take possession of the unit and you're out of a home anyway. So you decide, do you want to continue the relationship and keep it strong? Or do you want to be the reason that you actually get evicted? And also, if you pay late without an agreement, you could also be evicted for that. So be careful. Delaying it and agreeing to delaying it is okay, but taking it into your own hands is not. So work with your landlord and understand that both landlord and tenant are frustrated. It is a time where we all have no idea what the government is going to do. The government doesn't even know what they're going to do. And this is the problem. As things start to roll out, we're noticing more and more that things are being released. I saw that there was judges and a committee working on having the court system open up to more virtual and phone, but they're working on that. That's not something set in stone, and that's going to only come from the high level down. Small claims court and landlord and tenant board are not the priority right now. I know for landlords, it is a priority because this is the way that they pay for their mortgages. They pay for the upkeep of the property. And look, I'm feeling the burn myself. You know, I'm an investor. My family is investors. Dan has people in his family who are investors. This is hard on all of us. It's hard on every landlord. And all you can see is advocacy groups freaking out and saying, oh my God, there's rent strikes. The rent strikes are a very bad idea. It can cause you to get evicted. Work with your landlord. Your landlord's not out to get you. Your landlord is giving you the ability to rent their property. Work with them. And if you don't want to work with them, then it's your choice. You might want to leave and find another place.
So in particular, when somebody has sold the property and it is still tenanted, and tenant were issued notice to evict whatever due period is 60, 90 days according to their lease agreement. Mm-hmm. And if they do not evict on the completion of the transaction, are there any recourses, or the future buyer will just have to wait till these people get out, the situation normalizes, and government says, okay, it's okay to move out now, they can find another property to move to. So how difficult is it to evict a tenant on a closing day when the sale has already been agreed upon? Because there are some sales that happened even before COVID hit. Yeah. In December, in January, with longer closings, they're coming up for closing now. So what would happen to those closings?
So I'm going to answer this if that's okay.
I'm just going to mute myself so I can cough.
The landlord and tenant board is the only body that can force a person to leave a rental unit.
And they're not available, and evictions are on hold.
Right. So just the issuance of the notice does not guarantee that you are going to have vacant.
Totally agree, yeah.
So unfortunately, we're in a position where the government has suspended evictions, and the landlord and tenant. So right now, to get an eviction, you would have to get the landlord and tenant board to hear your case,
which is not possible.
Which is not possible for an N12, or which is not possible for an owner's or a purchaser's own use application.
Okay.
And if by some, either through a telephone hearing or something where an adjudicator called you up, to try and lessen that burden on you,
Okay.
and they issued an eviction order, you would have to take that eviction order to divisional court and request permission from the court to issue a direction to the sheriff to enforce vacant possession. So that's not something that you normally would have had to do before. What you would have done before is you would have gotten an order, and once the day on that order expired, you would go to the sheriff, and the sheriff would enforce vacant possession of that.
Okay.
So, I mean, to answer your question, you don't have a recourse.
So basically, the buyer is in limbo now because he already gave notice. If he's already renting, a first-time buyer, so he's stuck in between his landlord
That's right.
and future tenant.
That's right.
So like landlords can defer their mortgages by, it's 6 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when they do so, they are going to pay interest over interest.
Right.
So when tenants stop paying their rent because they cannot, their job is lost, they are in dire circumstances. So can the landlord pass on the cost they are going to incur extra, like interest over interest, to the tenant because this is their loss now? Or can they basically increase their rent for future payments beyond what rent control guidelines suggest us?
So the short answer is no. All right. So landlords will not be able to pass those increased costs on to their tenant. And the increase, at least 2020, is 2.2%. So you are not going to be able to increase beyond that. And for that, you have to do the proper form, providing 90 days notice. So that's the only way. I mean, there's no mechanism that would allow you to pass those costs on.
Well, I know many landlords. Some just became investors, fresh investors. They have 1 or 2 properties. They're on the fringe, a little cash flow coming in, and if their rent is disrupted, it's going to be a big deal for these people because they cannot hold the property and they cannot pay such a huge cost. I read an article where RBC kind of slapped close to $9,000 in deferral fee on a mortgage of $235,000. This was in Star News or CBC. I read it a few days back. That's a huge cost.
So there is a cost to it. There's no doubt that there's a cost to it. But the government is going up based on the fact that this is outside of human control at the moment.
But Dan, sorry to interrupt you. There was pandemic like that before too in 1918, I guess in 2005 or something, I'm not sure. There are a couple of pandemics, Ebola erupted. There was a pandemic in 1918. So government should have kind of some guidelines under these circumstances. Similar problems might have erupted. I wasn't born at that time. I don't know what kind of ministry was existing.
You have to understand that the laws have evolved since that time. Okay. And so in 1918, if your tenant stopped paying rent, you could kick them out to the curb and change the locks on the door 2 minutes after they were supposed to pay rent. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore, right? None of the things that we're dealing with at the moment existing, right? So current law, based on what's there, based on the times that we have, based on the legislative scheme that we currently use, we only have what the law allows us to do. And the law says the landlord and tenant board, and the increase is the increase. Now, is it possible that the government will enact legislation or will enact changes to legislation either during or after COVID that might help groups recoup some of that cost? Anything's possible.
Yeah, maybe they will help write off certain costs.
Right.
The landlords as well. Because I was just thinking, if people stop paying their mortgages, banks will put their property on power of sale right away. They won't care.
Well, the advantage is with courts closed, the banks can't do that.
Oh, okay. So bank cannot do that during pandemic?
Well, there's no court. The court's not available to issue writ of possession.
Well, that is just a different story. I totally get it. But they will still be filing all those things.
They might. But I think that you're going to find that judiciary will treat that a very similar way to how they treat non-payment now. I mean, it was a pandemic,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, I can't speak to what might happen. I can only speak to what we know right now.
Yeah.
And what we know right now is that there's no mechanism for what
Well,
those.
my takeaway from your conversation is that tenant and landlord should have a clear communication with each other
In writing.
in writing through text messages or emails. If they're phone calling each other, maybe start recording those phone calls like you suggested, and that they should give a notice the next day rent is owed if it's not paid.
That's right.
If
And
rent-
Sam said it earlier, and I firmly believe this to be true. If it's not in writing and if it's not recorded, it never happened.
Yeah, but when they give a notice to tenant, at the same time, they have to file a notice with the landlord and tenant board. Only then those 60 days are counted,
Mhm.
right? So when they give a notice on second, let's say the rent was due on 1st of month, and they give notice on second, will that notice be for the future 2 months, excluding that particular month, or that month will be included?
No, so notices work in perpetuity. So if I issue, let's say I had a tenant who didn't pay rent in the month of April.
Okay,
So on the 2nd of April, I issued them a non-payment of rent notice.
okay.
And within 14 days, they did not pay the rent that was owed.
Within 14 days, 2 weeks.
On the 15th day, I would file that with the landlord and tenant board. Once it's filed with the landlord and tenant board, any months after that will be dealt with on an update sheet on the day of the rental hearing.
Oh, I see. Whenever rent is due.
Whenever rent is due. So if it takes 3 months to get there, and at that time the tenant made missed 3 payments,
Yeah.
the adjudicator would be made aware of those additional payments at the time that the hearing was to take place.
Fantastic. It was a very knowledgeable session, Samantha and Dan. Abby, do you have any question to ask? Abby is an investor. He has many properties in his portfolio. I wonder if he has any rented out to any tenants.
Yeah, Abby, how are you doing? He's frozen, I think.
Oh,
Yeah, he's in the same position.
okay. Okay. So, yeah, I
How
see.
about Bill or Subhash or this other person who's on the phone?
Anybody has any question, please feel free to ask. This is your opportunity to shine. Subhash, do you have any question? Well, then I will.
If there's any questions after this, and you think of a question later on, you can definitely reach out to us, and we're happy to talk things through with you. Our information, I guess we can send them the information. Paul?
Yes, we can send them.
Yeah, they can call or email us, and I'll be happy to
Thank you
talk.
very much, Samantha, for reminding me, because when I spoke in the beginning, I didn't turn the recording on. So my portion is all cut out, but when you reminded me, then I clicked that.
Oh, okay, well, I can quickly do an outroduction. Let me do an outroduction. So again, guys, for the recording and everybody, Paul had introduced us. My name is Samantha Glass. I'm the owner and managing partner of SFG Paralegal Services. Been around for about 10 years. I am on the Landlord Self-Help Center. So the Landlord Self-Help Center, not related to my business, separate from this, is a self-help center where you can call and get summary legal advice. And I believe they charge a fee for it. It's a very nominal fee for service, but they do provide public legal education, and they are the landlords advocacy group in Ontario. They are currently funded by Legal Aid, but Legal Aid is cutting their funding. So they may shut down if we don't help them. So look up their website, Landlord Self-Help Center. I am also a television show host. I have a podcast and my own television show called Get Legal. That's out of Milton. and #1 best-selling author internationally in a collaborative book. So I do multiple different things. I'm also a paralegal instructor. So, I mean, I've been around the block. I'm also an investor. I've seen the things that happen to landlords. I've experienced them. I've also been a tenant. So I've seen it from both sides. I used to represent tenants in the beginning. Don't boo me, please. But I used to represent tenants. Dan is a tenant. Sorry, Dan. But listen, you know what? At the end of the day, we've seen it all. And if we haven't seen it all, then we do have friends in our networks, both lawyers and paralegals, who have seen things that we may not have seen. Dan, who's going to introduce himself quickly here, is my senior litigator. He is literally in court when the court is open every single day. My other partner is Zishan. I don't know if he's here. I don't think he's here, but he's also a litigator. These guys can tell you what's inside a courtroom, right? Dan.
My name is Dan Schofield. I'm a senior litigator and partner with SFG Paralegal Services. As Sam mentioned, when the courts are open, I am in court on average 19 days per month. So we're very familiar with everything that is before the courts, at least in the areas of practice that we have. Our contact info is listed in the presentation. It's also available by posting in the comment section if you want it later. We hope that you found this presentation informative, and you know, by all means, we're available at any time to answer your question.
Thank you, Stan and Samantha, and everyone who attended the meeting today. Like we have spoken many times, it's a very precarious situation. We totally sympathize with tenants. We totally sympathize with everyone who is affected. And thanks to our frontliners, doctors, nurses, police, who are trying to keep things in shape and keeping the discipline and policing in a very effective manner. It's a huge thing those guys are doing, risking their own lives for all of us.
Exactly.
Our duty is to maintain our social distancing and try to avoid this thing from happening. I was reading that we are very successful in flattening the curve. We have less casualties. Well, guys, keep it that way. Thank you very much for joining us. And if there is any question, you can always reach me, reach Samantha. His information was there. And I can always share her web link, which is, I guess, very easy to remember. It was on screen here. And thanks once again. Thank you, Samantha, once again.
Thanks, Paul. Always great to be here. And Abby, nice to see you, and everybody else. High five, everybody. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks.